This video is a demonstration of how we embed otoliths for sectioning at the Marquette Fisheries Research Station. For embedding our otoliths, we use 26 cell silicone embedding molds made by SPI, model number 2443. We also have deeper molds from SPI, model 2449, but we rarely need to use these. Once in a while we get a thicker otolith that they work for, but most of the time everything fits in our normal 26 cell molds. We embed our otoliths in a two-step process. We first put a layer of epoxy in the bottom of the cells and let that cure. That's just to make sure that the otolith ends up completely encapsulated in epoxy. After the epoxy cures, we put the otolith in and then cover it with a second layer. The epoxy we use is made by West System. We use the 105 epoxy resin with the 207 special clear hardener. We like this epoxy for several reasons. One, it's readily available. We usually get ours through West Marine. Generally, they have the best price, but you can find it many places online, including Amazon. We also like that it cures fairly rapidly. We can section otoliths within 20 to 24 hours after they've been embedded. It clears, or it's very clear when it hardens, and the price isn't too bad either. For the gallon system that we have, it's about $150, give or take, but that much epoxy will last us several years. So to mix our epoxy, we do have instructions written out. Main thing on this is to make sure that you have the proper ratio of the resin to the hardener. If you don't get the ratio correct, it won't harden, and generally it just destroys your samples. Most of the time when I mix, I do 18.5 grams to 5 grams, but I have just a couple molds to fill right now, so do the 11.1 to 3. If you're doing large batches, this epoxy is nice because you get what they call the mini pumps. It's just the pump on them, and they're calibrated so that it's one pump of the resin to one pump of the hardener. But for small amounts, it's better just to weigh them out. So to mix our epoxy, we use these 5.5 ounce cups. You can obviously use any sort of container you want. These are nice because they're inexpensive, and it's also nice because every time the epoxy cures, you can just do another layer on top of it. So I can probably do like 50 or more batches of epoxy in a single cup before it needs to be thrown away. We start by zeroing out the balance with the cup, then add the resin. So this one will be 11.1. There is a little bit of leeway with the ratio. So about 11.1, tear it again, and 3 grams of the hardener. Then mix the epoxy for about a minute with this little metal spatula. It is important to mix it really well, but don't go too crazy. If you really whip it up, you get a ton of air bubbles. You get some air bubbles anyways, but it's good not to get too many. While I'm mixing, I'm going to talk about the orientation of the otoliths within the molds. I like to put them in the molds pointy side to the top, and I try to get them as close to the top of the mold as possible. That just gives a little more space for clamping the blocks in the saw chuck when you go to section them. I also like to keep the sulcus side up on the otoliths. If the sulcus is down, sometimes an air bubble will form underneath. Basically, the sulcus won't fill with epoxy. And when that happens, they're more likely to break while you're sectioning them or sanding them after you section them. The epoxy should be mixed well enough now. For transferring the epoxy to the molds, I use these disposable 3 milliliter transfer pipettes. You can get these from Amazon. They're very inexpensive and they're actually great for transferring the epoxy. To do the first layer in a mold, I do 3 drops in each cell. Makes it really easy because you can keep a consistent amount in each cell. Epoxy is fairly thick, so what I normally do is 3 drops for the first layer, and I put them on one end of the cell. I won't do the entire mold right now. And what I'll do once the mold is full, if you just put the epoxy in the cells, they don't always completely cover the bottom. So I put the epoxy in one end and then I'll just tilt it to get them to cover the entire bottom. Then once the entire bottom is covered, when you set them down, the epoxy will then level out. For cells that have otoliths in them, it's usually at least 3 drops to cover them. More often than not, it's 4. It just depends on how much epoxy you put in the first layer and how large the otoliths are. So these I usually start with 3 drops, and then after I've filled all the cells, I'll go back through and add more if needed. It's not critical to make sure that the cells are completely filled level at the top, but it does help if they are when you section. So that's what I try to do. Normally I would do the whole mold first, but for demonstration purposes I'll just do these few. The epoxy is fairly thick, so it tends to move the otoliths around a little, so once the cells are all filled, I'll go back through and realign the otoliths. At this point, I also make sure that there are no large air bubbles right at the otolith. It's fine if they're elsewhere in the cell, but if they're right at the otolith, increase the likelihood that they'll break while sectioning. So once all the cells are filled and you have them aligned properly, you let them sit for about 24 hours and they should be cured, and at that point you can go ahead and do your sectioning.